answered. To date, 49 questions have been addressed in the House, and this number does not yet include 6 questions for the 15th sitting, 5 of which will be answered orally and 1 for written response. The motion this month will be carried by Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development, Councillor Dr. Agatha Carrington, and is centered on the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in respect of reduced inequalities and the promotion of peaceful and inclusive society. The motion is seeking support of the House to set up a multidisciplinary stakeholder committee to prepare a position paper with a focus on the inclusion of differently abled persons in the Tobago workplace and to formulate a framework for registering them. As presiding officer, I invite you to join us in the public gallery or view us on the Tobago Channel 5, Facebook or YouTube channels live for another debate on your future. The 15th sitting of the Tobago all of our citizens in this our land, so that peace and happiness, truth and justice may be enjoyed by all people. Grant this for the sake of our Lord Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Oath of allegiance of a new member. Announcements by presiding officer. Assembly bills sent back from cabinet. Assembly laws brought back from parliament. Petition papers.
Secretary of Finance and the Economy.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I have the privilege of tabling the Tobago House of Assembly's monthly budget report as at the end of April 2018 in this honorable House.
Presentation of reports from Dispute Resolution Commission, select committees. Questions to secretaries.
Question number 46 by the Minority Leader.
Madam Presiding Officer, thank you. To the Chief Secretary and Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy, provide a total press that wrong, right? Question to the Chief Secretary, Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy. Provide a total number of monthly paid workers within the Tobago House of Assembly. Identify how many are employed via temporary contract workers compared to those who have been appointed permanently via the Public Service Commission public servants.
Secretary, Chief Secretary and Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. In respect of monthly paid employees who are employed on contracts, according to the question, the figure stands at 1,739, and in respect of those appointed by way of the Public Service Commission, the numbers stand at 1,890.
Question number 51 by the Minority Leader.
the Chief Secretary, Secretary of Education, Innovation, and Energy. Recently, there were United States of America Air Force planes and Black Hawk helicopters landing in Tobago. A. What was the purpose of those visits? B. How will those visits benefit Tobago? C. Was there any connection between the presence of those U.S. air vessels and the Russian intelligence gathering spy vessel, the Viktor Leonov presence in Trinidad and Tobago's water in 2018?
Chief Secretary and Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Exercise Fuse Response is an annual routine exercise that has been sponsored by the United States government via the United States Southern Command since 2012. Similar exercises have been hosted over the years in the region by countries such as Guyana, Belize, Honduras, and Guatemala. This exercise was being funded by the United States government with minimal costs to the government of Trinidad and Tobago. The Trinidad and Tobago government was certainly appreciative of this show of partnership by the United States government, considering our country's current economic constraints. Exercise Fuse Response is a crisis response training exercise that is designed to enhance the ability of both the governments of Trinidad and Tobago and the United States to plan, coordinate, and rapidly respond to a crisis with regional security implications. It is therefore, or was therefore, a learning opportunity for both countries. The exercise additionally was designed to build capacity and strengthen the crisis response capabilities and readiness of both countries' national security agencies. It was also an opportunity for Trinidad and Tobago to exercise a whole-of-government response to a crisis, test our emergency response plans, validate our processes, and identify any possible gaps. The capacity built and lessons learned from this exercise would also benefit our CARICOM neighbors who have partnered with and sought national security assistance from Trinidad and Tobago in the past. With Trinidad and Tobago having lead responsibility for security matters in CARICOM, it is important that we always stand ready to serve our CARICOM neighbors. This exercise Fuse Response, that is, took place from the 16th to the 27th of April 2018 in both Trinidad and Tobago. In preparation for the exercise, United States military troops arrived in the coming weeks, or in the past weeks, before the 16th of April, which was the start date. Approximately 270 United States military personnel were involved in this exercise, alongside our Trinidad and Tobago national security agencies. Areas that witnessed the presence of troops for the exercise in Trinidad were the Piarco International Airport, Comuto, Couva, and Macquarie, and the A&R Robinson Airport and areas in such vicinity in Tobago. Exercise Fuse Response, Madam Presiding Officer, was only a simulation exercise. As I indicated, the goal was to ensure that our national security agencies are capable and equipped to protect our citizens, residents, and visitors alike while they are on Tobago soil. So it was designed to be as realistic as possible to ensure and to allow our security agencies to gauge their readiness capabilities. However, the scenarios were entirely fictitious and had no relation to any real threat nor situation in Trinidad and Tobago. It was also designed to cause minimum disruption to the general public However, advisories and advance notices were issued by the relevant authorities in areas where exercises were conducted and which may have required the public to make temporary adjustments. Resources utilized were not usually part of the Trinidad and Tobago national security landscape, but these were needed to facilitate the scenarios which were tested. The public was assured that the presence of these resources was in compliance with our local laws and, of course, was only to be used for the express purpose of the exercise. No enhanced status has been given to the United States government for this exercise, and Trinidad and Tobago continues to be an independent, sovereign state. Furthermore, it must be noted that Exercise Fuse Response was confined within Trinidad and Tobago territory and did not extend beyond this country. Neither the government of Trinidad and Tobago nor the American government indicated that the presence of the United States air vessels were connected with the Russian intelligence gathering spy vessel, the Victor Leonov, presence in Trinidad and Tobago's waters in 2018. Additionally, both the Ministry of National Security and the Tobago House of Assembly kept the public informed about Exercise Fuse Response through press conferences, press releases, and ongoing information disseminated in the public domain throughout the period of the exercise.
Question number 52 by the Minority Leader.
To the Secretary of Tourism, Culture and Transportation, with reference to the Tobago Jazz Experience 2018, please provide the following information. A, the total number of general and VIP tickets printed for sale. B, the total number of each type of ticket sold at full price and the total revenue made from those sales. C, the total number of tickets sold at reduced prices, giving the reduced prices and the total revenue made from those sales. D, how much money was spent on alcohol for the special invited guests. E, how much money was spent on Tobago-based artists, Trinidad-based artists, regional artists, and international artists. F, how much money was spent on each of the following: tent, chair, lights, stage, sound, and event management. Thank you.
Secretary of Tourism, Culture and Transportation.
Thank you very much, Madam Presiding Officer. Madam Presiding Officer, at this point, all accounting details are being prepared by the Accounting Department of the Tobago Festivals Commission. I am therefore asking that the response to this question be deferred to the next sitting.
Noted. Question number 53 by the Minority Leader.
Question to the Secretary of Finance and the Economy. With reference to the 2017 to 2018 fiscal budget of the Tobago House of Assembly, please provide the following as of April 30th, 2018. A, how much of the approved recurrent expenditure budget has already been spent, and what is the balance? B, how much of the development program's expenditure has already been spent, and what is the balance? Thank you.
Secretary of Finance and the Economy.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. As at the end of April 30th, as it relates to recurrent expenditure, the revised allocation at this time is $1,836,669,930. Total releases to divisions to date under recurrent expenditure total $1,149,126,154. The balance on allocation as at April 30th currently stands at $826,366,303. The actual expenditure or total expenditure, including commitments, currently stands at $1,903,627, resulting in a balance on releases of $522,527. As it relates to the development program, the revised allocation at this time currently stands at $339,013,070. Total expenditure, including commitments, currently stands at $114,602,702. The balance of releases at this time currently stands at $73,945,080.
Question number 55 by the Minority Councillor.
To the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development, please indicate whether the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development or any other component of the Tobago House of Assembly for use by the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development purchased any property, meaning land and or building, on or before January 2017. That should be on or before on or after January 2017. For each purchase, please provide the following: the date and number of the Executive Council minute authorizing purchase, a description of the property, as in owner's location, size, the total cost, indicating the amount paid and balance outstanding, the date checks were issued and the payee on each check, and the current status of the property, as in, is the property still occupied, by whom, and have new structures been erected.
Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. The date and number of the Executive Council minute authorizing the purchase is January 18th, 2017, by Executive Council minute number 41. The description of the property: Mr. Carlton Romeo, lot number 2, Union Trace, Wim, Tobago, 10,075 square feet of land with a floor space of 6,675 square feet. The total cost, $2.7 million. The checks issued, check number 003511 of the 11th of May 2017 to the Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Finance Company. Current status of the property: the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development is in occupancy and no new structures have been erected. Thank you.
Question number 56 by the Minority Councillor.
to the Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development with reference to Section 55.2, compulsory retirement, and 55.3, employment beyond the normal retirement date of the TRHA's human resource policies and procedures. Please provide the following information: the number and categories of contract workers who have attained the retirement age of 60 on or before December 31st, 2017, and are still or were retired or were retained on contract to date. The number and categories of contract workers who have attained the retirement age of 60 on or before April 30th, 2018, and have been contacted indicating that their current contract will not be renewed, and the number and categories of contract workers who will attain the age of 60 after May 1st, 2018, but before December 31st, 2019.
Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. The information requested requires some more time, excuse me, and therefore I ask that this be provided at the next sitting. Thank you.
Noted.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Assembly on definite matters of urgent public importance. Statements by secretaries or assistant secretaries, personal explanations, introduction of bills, motions relating to the business or sitting of the Assembly and moved by a secretary or assistant secretary.
Leader of Assembly Business.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I beg to move, be it resolved that the standing orders of the Tobago House of Assembly be referred to the Standing Orders Committee for consideration and report within the current session. So move.
Members, the question put. Be it resolved that the standing orders of the Tobago House of Assembly be referred to the Standing Orders Committee for consideration and report within the current session. All in favor? Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The motion is carried.
Public business, executive council business, motion.
Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. And the motion reads, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015 speaks to, among other things, reduce inequalities and the promotion of a peaceful and inclusive society. And whereas at the national level there is a recognition of the need for a policy to govern work and employment as it relates to differently abled persons. And whereas the Tobago House of Assembly has provided support to the numerous differently abled Tobagonians directly through disability grants and indirectly through partnerships with several non-governmental organizations which cater for the specific needs of the differently abled. And whereas the Tobago House of Assembly, through the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development, has identified the need for increased focus and accelerated action for the inclusion of the differently abled in the workplace, be it resolved that this House support the Executive Council decision to set up a broad-based, multidisciplinary stakeholder committee to prepare a position paper with an emphasis on inclusion of differently abled in the workplace in Tobago. And be it further resolved that this committee formulate a framework for the establishment of a register of differently abled persons on the island. Madam Presiding Officer, I table this motion in my capacity as Secretary for Health, Wellness and Family Development. This motion seeks to address the vexing issue of the limited inclusion of the differently abled in our community. Madam Presiding Officer, I will present the problem of inclusion of the differently abled worldwide in the region in Trinidad and Tobago, and I will summarize the experiences in various countries, the progress made, and the challenges faced. My colleagues will support this discourse and speak to different areas. Madam Presiding Officer, let me recognize the community of differently abled persons with whom I've had the privilege to work and who have been providing yeoman service to our island, on this island, and for whom this motion is of critical import and for whom we will continue to advocate. Madam Presiding Officer, this motion is timely since the 11th conference of the states parties to the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities will convene between the period 12 to 14 June 2018. The theme this year is leaving no one behind through the full implementation of the CRPD, which is the speaking to the Convention of the Rights of those persons with disabilities. It is timely in that we are seeking to canvass and obtain as wide as is possible views from a cross-section of persons in our community. More particularly, Madam Presiding Officer, the Sustainable Development Goals points to a disability-inclusive framework, and several of those goals point to inclusiveness. So Goal 4 points to guaranteeing equal and accessible education by building inclusive learning environments. We have Goal 8 as well, Goal 10, Goal 11, Goal 17, Goal 11, Goal 6. All of those goals point to the need for or set a framework for inclusiveness. And therefore, the context within which this discourse will continue would be within the framework of the SDGs, within the framework of the CRPD, and work done by our own country in terms of our Vision 2030. Madam Presiding Officer, I recall the words of Professor Stephen Hawkins, deceased, as he mentioned. Disability need not be an obstacle to success. And he's speaking, I've had motor neuron disease for practically all my adult life, yet it has not prevented me from having a prominent career in astrophysics and a happy family life. Madam Presiding Officer, the World Bank reports that 1 billion persons, or 15% of the world's population, experience some form of disability. And disability is prevalent the prevalence of disability is higher in developing countries. So that, Madam Presiding Officer, 1/5 of the estimated global total, or between 110 and 190 million persons, experience significant disabilities. So that with over 1 billion people or persons living with disabilities, we need to look at those areas that we can improve the opportunities for them and to make this world much more sustainable. When you look at children, an estimated 93 to 150 million children, 0 to 14 years, live with some form of disability. Look, this data comes out of the global report by the UN in 2015. So today, we in Tobago, we call for inputs by a range of stakeholders, all arms of government, civil society, and all organizations with responsibility for persons with disabilities. When I looked at Trinidad and Tobago's data, I noted that over 23,000 persons are living with disabilities. though in terms of Tobago, the data, there are gaps in the data, but that the Social Welfare Department noted that over 300 persons are being serviced by them, disabled persons are being serviced, but yet there are others who are not or who are not yet accounted for. So that there's a gap in that data. Persons with disabilities, Madam Presiding Officer, are likely to experience adverse socioeconomic outcomes than those without disabilities, such as less education, poor health outcomes, lower levels of employment, and even higher poverty rates. And so several barriers exist for them. The physical environment in which they live, the transportation issues, communication, gaps in service delivery, like in healthcare and so on. And therefore, we recognize there's a need for us to intervene. Madam Presiding Officer, globally, persons with disabilities have been recognized as one of the largest minority groups which have been vulnerable to neglect, deprivation, segregation, and exclusion. When I looked at what is occurring in countries like India, after India's independence, Madam Presiding Officer, the government of India accepted its responsibility for this sizable marginalized group and has formulated various programs for welfare and rehabilitation of these persons with disabilities. Looking at their data further, 4 to 8% of the population in India are differently abled. 1 in every 10 children is born or acquires a mental, physical, or sensory disability. And this is a substantial number. Even if our situation in Tobago or in Trinidad is not as grave, we still think, Madam Presiding Officer, that we must address the whole matter of inclusiveness. In consideration of those priority areas and those goals that were identified in the SDGs, we feel that we must continue to pay attention to the issue of inclusiveness. And so much of our discussions would be centered around that. Madam Presiding Officer, those areas that include education, employment and decent work, social protection, and non-discrimination are important for us to note. Notwithstanding the fact that Trinidad and Tobago signed on to the UNCRPD, which is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and ratified in 2015, there is still much more to be done, such that we could promote, protect, and ensure that these rights of persons with disabilities can be preserved. Madam Presiding Officer, the rights of persons with disabilities is a human rights issue. And as Secretary for Health, Wellness and Family Development, and my team, it is our responsibility to lead the charge and to champion this charge, such that we can address these matters that confront them. It is our intention to collaborate, Madam Presiding Officer, and my colleagues and those on the other side, that we collaborate with the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. But we think we must lead the way because much more could have been done. Madam Presiding Officer, the differently able do not need handouts. We must create an enabling environment for them to thrive. It is their right. According to the chair of the Down Syndrome Network, Glenn Niles, we have to move away from the charity model towards the social model. We must move towards an eventual situation where there's full inclusion. Inclusion, therefore, is the achievement of a work environment in which all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully, having equal access to opportunities and resources, and can contribute fully to the organization's success. When we look at social inclusion, Madam Presiding Officer, the process of improving the ability and the opportunity and indeed the dignity of our people is important because we want all of those persons to take part in society. The Express Tribune editorial of December 7th, 2017 noted that inclusion of all segments of society is a hallmark of a strong democratic country. Differently abled persons deserve equal say in day-to-day matters. Recognizing their intelligent abilities, Madam Presiding Officer, they comprise a crucial part of society. And so I will want to point to some issues around inclusiveness in education. And this will be elaborated by the other presenters. Madam Presiding Officer, inclusive education must be understood as inclusion of the differently abled person in regular schools. It differs from previously held notions of integration and mainstreaming, which tended to be concerned principally with disability and special education needs, and implied that learners are changing from becoming ready for accommodation by the mainstream. So by contrast, Madam Presiding Officer, inclusion is about the child's right to participate and the school's duty to accept. This is what we must pursue. In the case of what is happening in the United States, Madam Presiding Officer, where we note it's highly likely that children with disabilities will comprise a large group, and data is showing that they comprise a large group of persons. I just want to point to a few things that are happening. And I want to draw on that as well as speak to what is happening in that noted in Trinidad as well. Since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, multiple indicators demonstrate improvements in social inclusion and the like, and that several persons have had the opportunity to benefit from services and have access that hitherto they did not have. And so I wanted to point to that. But in looking at what has been happening in the Trinidad and Tobago setting, the efforts at inclusion I noted were as early as 2008, a study commissioned by the Ministry of Education to look at a plan that treats with inclusiveness, the Miskiewicz and Associates plan. And the first issue that was raised, and one of the most important goals that they sought, is to build attitudinal and philosophical awareness of inclusion among all personnel. It is 10 years, it is a decade later, and there's still much more to be done. When you look at employment, work is an important social and financial involvement for persons with disabilities. And we think that this provides a rich opportunity and a rich venue for social inclusion. And much of the research is pointing to that. However, there's much more to be done. We note in the case of the United Kingdom, persistently low employment rates among disabled individuals. And I noted that a study done by Bornberg and others in 2015, where they pointed to the issues with respect to low employment rates. When we look at what is happening in terms of other countries, and I tried to look at several because this is really a wide-ranging topic. Issues around employment and decent work, and the way we must ensure that or differently abled persons are able to be included and break that vicious cycle of poverty and marginalization. Those areas require attention. We note where working-age persons with disabilities are less likely to be employed than their non-disabled peers. But what is happening with the legal and policy framework? Governments in several countries have been playing a crucial role in creating and enabling legal and policy environment. But again, there's much more to be done. The intention of this is to ensure that we have a much more inclusive environment for our differently abled. When we look at what is happening in terms of health services, persons with disabilities tend to suffer poorer health, have less access to health care, often find barriers in accessing health care, have challenges with the attitudes of health service providers, and the like. There are physical barriers as well in terms of the design of our health facilities, although some work has been done locally, but there are still challenges that exist. And so there are barriers to facilities, including inaccessible parking areas, uneven accesses to buildings, poor signage, narrow doorways, and the like. And these must be addressed. When we look at social protection and welfare, several challenges still exist. There's poor coordination of services to the disabled. There are limited access to mainstream vocational education. The professional potential of a people that could be tapped remains untapped. There's limited consultation of children, limited consultation with persons with disabilities in terms of planning their services. Sometimes the programs we develop do not explicitly state the target population or does not include the range of services that these persons require. And therefore, this motion is seeking to look at several of those. And so, social inclusion is essential and important as we seek to enhance the quality of life of those persons with disabilities. We note that the government of Trinidad and Tobago, through the same Ministry of Social Development, they've been working on amending the last, or have worked on amending the last national policy on persons with disabilities. Still, there are areas, still there are gaps. So our thrust through this motion is to fully engage all stakeholders and provide feedback for inclusion in the draft policy. We want to embark on this initiative such that it can benefit the disabled community. We will not wait, we cannot wait. They require our support now. Madam Presiding Officer, permit me to point to research with respect to inclusiveness in employment in other countries. An inclusive labor market can be defined as a labor market in which everyone can participate regardless of any form of disability or vulnerability. Therefore, including disadvantaged and low productive workers who contribute to the best of their abilities must be considered by all employers. Madam Presiding Officer, equal opportunity and equal treatment must be included in gainful employment of persons with disabilities. Indeed, this is their right. The employment rate of persons in Canada, and I looked at Canadians between ages 25 to 64, and the data for 2011 pointed to an employment rate of 49%, compared with persons without disability, the rate being 79%. University graduates with a mild or moderate disability had employment rates that did not significantly differ from those of their counterparts without a disability. In part because persons with disabilities are less likely to be university educated, they were more likely to be employed in specific occupations such as personal service and customer service occupations. When you look at what is happening in the United States, and a recent study done last year, where they tried to examine employment and choice-making for adults with intellectual disability, autism, and Down syndrome. They tried to examine the current state of employment for 3 groups of adults with intellectual disability, individuals with autism, individuals with Down syndrome, and the like. The adults with Down syndrome had the highest rates of paid community jobs, but adults with, and I call it ID, the had the highest rates of choice making. So employment rates remain low despite national efforts to find jobs for persons with disabilities. Choice making being a unique factor that was found to be associated with the employment status and providing a target for interventions to increase their employability. When you look at what is happening in other European countries, the need to step forward and to integrate persons with disabilities has been recognized, and they aim to create a much more inclusive labor market so that those persons can benefit. Just moving closer home to Jamaica, in a recent study through a World Bank project, and this project sought to improve the social and economic inclusion of people with disabilities in the wider Jamaican society. Of the 123 individuals who received employment during round one, 17% were still employed 6 months after completing training. However, as subsequent training rounds are completed, an increase in this employment rate is anticipated by the time the project closes. We hope that as they continue, that those disabled persons can actively participate in the workplace. I pointed to some issues with respect to legislation, but there's a particular area that I want to mention. The whole matter and let me point to the whole issue of quota system for the disabled. There's an approach that was implemented, for instance, in Germany, France, Austria, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and Poland, where with the application of a quota system, companies are forced to employ a minimum percentage of persons with disabilities. And Madam Presiding Officer, quotas range from 2% in Spain to 7% in Italy. Most countries adopted a quota of 5% of the workforce. However, many of the quota systems allow for a fine that organizations can pay, and that releases them from fulfilling the quota. So that you may either obey or you pay the fine. People have been doing that. And so this persistent low employment rate among disabled persons continues to be an enduring concern of governments across developed and even developing countries, and has been the subject of several policy initiatives. Indeed, Trinidad and Tobago is the same. When you look at, and we advocate that as well, inclusiveness with respect to transportation, there are challenges with respect to transportation for the differently able, and therefore there is need for greater awareness of the need to provide the adequate transportation and accessible transportation for those persons with disabilities. When you look at the built environment, access to the built physical environment, the structural adjustments required to our pavements or buildings, whether they be public or private, such that you can allow them to have complete access. Indeed, there are some vehicles with wheelchair access, but there are many more to be done, many more areas to have those in our public transport system. And so inclusiveness is a key area for us, be it in health, be it in education, be it in transport, all of these areas. These are important areas that we want to consider, and we expect that the policymakers that are driving the national policy, that these areas will be considered because they are important for our disabled community. The matter of, and I wanted to point to another area in terms of social support. Inclusiveness with respect to social support is an area and a major gap as well. There is need for greater participation in support groups or for support groups to support those who are differently abled. We think as well that our media awareness programs should sensitize the public much more with respect to what is happening and to assist us in terms of addressing those issues with respect to this disabled community. I think one thing that advocates of inclusion tend to forget is that children who do not have special needs can develop better skills if they work closely with children with special needs. And so inclusiveness benefits both the person that is differently abled and the person who is abled. Finally, Madam Presiding Officer, it should be understood that where inclusion is considered, all of facilities must take into account the way they are designed such that they are not creating serious disadvantages for the differently abled. We think that they must consider all these areas in terms of access, mobility, and the ability to freely move. We think that it is a right that all our members of the population should benefit just as those persons who are less able. We think that there's a need for us to ensure that as we give them the support, they become much more able to contribute to society. We think that if we empower and motivate our persons with disabilities, they can participate in all the services that are available to those who are able. Much has been said with respect to the differently abled, but where is the research that supports some of the work that is required to be done? We advocate proper assessment and early diagnosis of our differently abled persons towards early detection and early intervention so that persons could be screened, assessed, diagnosed, and be treated and managed early. Where is the research as well for us to identify those persons who are differently abled early? Perhaps we have to diligently look at how we can do those feasibility studies as well to provide better services for them. Madam Presiding Officer, it is all about inclusion of those persons who are disabled. Not only including them in the classroom, but including them in society. We must develop a nation, Madam Presiding Officer, that thinks about all its people, from the sidewalk access to the man with the wheelchair, to shorter waiting times in the emergency room. It is all about inclusion, Madam Presiding Officer. I beg to move.
Members, the question proposed. Whereas the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015 speaks to, among other things, reduce inequalities and the promotion of a peaceful and inclusive society. And whereas at the national level, there's a recognition of the need for a policy to govern work and employment as it relates to the differently abled persons. And whereas the Tobago House of Assembly has provided support to the numerous differently abled Tobagonians directly through disability grants and indirectly through partnership with several non-governmental organizations which cater to the specific needs of the differently abled. And whereas the Tobago House of Assembly, through the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development, has identified the need for increased focus and accelerated action for the inclusion of the differently abled in the workplace, be it resolved that this House support the Executive Council decision to set up a broad-based, multidisciplinary stakeholder committee to prepare a position paper with an emphasis on inclusion of differently abled persons in the workplace in Tobago. And be it further resolved that this committee formulate a framework for the establishment of a register of differently abled persons on the island. Minority Leader.
Madam Presiding Officer, I thank you for the opportunity to speak in this honorable House. I want to pay special acknowledgement to the students from the Technical Vocational Center for Persons with Disability and their hard-working teachers, Ms. Bacchus, Ms. Thomas, and Ms. Orr Cyrus. We are delighted to have you in the house today. I also want to pay special respect to those persons who may have physical challenges and those who are here in support of the motion. The motion is a good one. The motion is one that the Minority Council will not seek to condemn or lower in any way. However, I want to spend just a few moments, Madam Presiding Officer, addressing the Chief Secretary through you, for whom the responsibility of this good house falls upon. You see, disability, and my colleague Dr. Faith will give you all those legal jargons and definitions, etc., what disability is. Disability is not only for those persons who lack vision, for those persons in wheelchair, who have speech impediment, etc. It goes beyond that. And for over 2 years, the population of Tobago were treated as if they were all disabled because they were unable to use the air bridge and the sea bridge. Totally. We are concerned about that, about able people forcing others who should be able to become disabled. This is what I want my good friend, the Chief Secretary, to stop and stamp out in Tobago. I also want him to pay close attention to the fact that it will take more than a special select committee or a group of people from the East, West, North, and South to improve the condition of the disabled persons in Tobago. What we need is legislative changes. And I would have expected my friend, who would have been the presiding officer of this house for 4 long years, to learn a thing or two, Madam Presiding Officer. But indeed, they have read the front cover of this book called Tobago House of Assembly Act, still enforceable, but they have not checked on the contents. I wish to read for my good friend today, as we support this bill, of course, one line that comes from section 25. I know he's taking it down, so I will not go very fast, as he takes some verbatim notes on that side. It will help you in your future presiding over the Executive Council. What it says is that the role of the Tobago House of Assembly, my friend, the role of the Tobago House of Assembly is to formulate and implement policies in keeping with Schedule 5. Formulate and implement policies. Not to create committees, not to engage in sideshows. These things are things that should be done by the snap of a finger, like that. We don't need to come here and waste precious parliamentary time, precious Tobago House of Assembly time to debate this. This is a non-issue. We agree that there should be a committee to facilitate the needs of the differently able people in Tobago, to ensure they're properly provided for. We don't need to come here for that. What should have been done, and I'm going to give you a little timeline to the Honorable Presiding Officer, is that we should have set up a committee outside. You could have come to us. You have my number. You call me for all different types of nonsense. You could have called me and said, look, let's have a discussion. And we would have gladly come by you, or you come by us, which is under James Park there by the tree. You have room there for everyone. You come there by us. We can come by you. Differently able people too. Differently able people. There's no high elevators. It's accessible. Wheelchair-bound persons could attend it. You could have come there. And we would have simply agreed with you and say, look, let's form the committee. End the talk. Let's form the committee. Do it. We have no opposition to that. But to bring us into this honorable house, to waste good time is not right. So having formed the committee outside, the committee should have been given a mandate to draft rules or policy or guidelines, regulations, whatever. And those will draft, as I said, draft those things, which would have come to the Chief Secretary. He would have shared it with the Executive Council, and then you bring it to the House to debate. This is what the Tobago House, the drafters of this act, contemplated when they drafted. They say we are supposed to formulate and implement policy. So having a draft policy, you bring it so we could better formulate the policy. And having voted upon those policies, we then pass it. I know he's asking his good friend there, Comrade Joel Dupont-Jack. I hear him asking him, how does he know that? I want to say to you, I'm training for your job. I'm training for your job. That's how I know that. That's the way things ought to go here. Madam Presiding Officer, if we have to assist our differently able people, and I see them with compassion, because a leader must have compassion, one of the first things we ought to do is to try to have the central government amend things like the OSHA Act, which does not cater for the differently able people. Chief Secretary looking surprised. He's alarmed by that. You could ask me, I'm a trade unionist, on another day. I will tell you, it doesn't cater for the differently abled people. There is no legislation within the OSHA Act that provides for the differently able people. So we have a lot of streets in Scarborough, a lot of buildings in Scarborough, where these good people have to access services unaccessible. They almost gave me one up the road there, and then they took it back and gave it to the police. I'm saying, Madam Presiding Officer, we need to address the law. The Occupational Health and Safety Act must speak to the needs of differently able people. And all buildings in Trinidad and Tobago, all access to public spaces, yes, even Argyle Waterfall, even Pigeon Peak, which is the highest peak in Speyside, Shallaville, Speyside world. Yes. Even people who want to go on the reef, they must have access. Who wants to go to Little Tobago, we're talking about protected spaces, they must have access. This is what I expect to hear in this good house. How do we formulation of policies to treat with legislation that would debar these persons from enjoying a decent life as they should? But we're not hearing that from them. Instead, they want to waste the Tobago House of Assembly time by forming another committee. This is the 9th committee they are forming for the year, the 9th one. The first one was Code of Conduct. Code of Conduct, Madam Presiding Officer. And here we have in this standing orders, this order of business here, every month we come here and we see it. Special reports, there is none. No report is coming back from the Food Nutrition Committee. No report is coming back from the Constitutional Amendment Bill Committee. But they want to form another committee. I'm saying we are for the committee. Yes, form the committee. Go ahead, form it. But please, have the courtesy, have the decency, have the manliness to report back to this house on a timely basis. We shouldn't be begging for a report. We should not be begging for a report. So again, we agree to this. Fix the legislation, fix the OSHA Act. Secondly, you must address the issue of the Equal Opportunities Bill. I don't know who passed a bill like that, but they do not cater for the differently able people in that bill. No, in the Equal Opportunities Act, they do not cater for differently able people. And I'm saying to you, when you look at the Westminster system that you love to boast and talk about, that we under the Westminster system, I ask myself, which system in the Westminster they are under? Which system? It can't be the British Parliament they are following. Because in 2010, 8 years ago, the British Parliament would have passed a document called the UK Equality Act 2010. And in that act, there are 9 protected areas. 9 protected areas. One of those areas is disability. Persons with disability must be protected. They must have access to cars like anybody else, to license a car like anybody else. I see 2 of my colleagues there who are driving cars, and I salute them. You have broken the barrier. Thank God for the genes you have within you, and that is Roxborough genes. They have it. They're from Roxborough. We overcome obstacles. So I salute you all and put it on the record. Roxborough genes they have. We expect to hear something like that. How do you treat with the fact that they are discriminated in the OSH Act? It's discriminate against them. How do you treat the fact that the Equal Opportunities Commission discriminate against them, but you want to form committee? To do what? But we support your committee anyway, because that's the level of my colleagues across their thinking, forming committees. Again, as I take my seat, because I will not debate this long, it's like trying to control the breeze. The breeze goes wherever it wants to go. You can't control it. We're not going to try to control them, but I will say this. This house, Madam Presiding Officer, this house, this honorable house, this dignified house that was here since the 17-something, this house, albeit constructed differently, this house, the role of this house is to formulate and implement policies, not to form committees. Thank you.
Representative for Bethel Mount Irvin.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I want to begin also by thanking my colleague who is advising me to bring the discussion back and not play, as some would, politics with people's lives, their livelihoods, and the future that ought to be promised to them by their God and their government. Madam Presiding Officer, some 2 years ago, thereabout, if my timeline is correct, the Central Administration in Tobago, under the auspices of the People's National Movement, made some promises to the people of Tobago that we would revise our governance systems and structures in such a way that we would give occasion to persons here in Tobago to realize their fullest potential. Over that period of time, Madam Presiding Officer, this administration has articulated, clarified, and enacted some of those policy decisions which we would have promised the people to ensure, if by no other means, that there is access to quality education for all peoples, that the health sector in Tobago represents a dynamic service where quality care can be afforded to our people, not just residents or islanders, but also our visitors. That we must work hand in hand with all sectors of society to construct, as it were, a robust private sector. And we have heard it, we know it. And I'm only reminding us so that we understand the context within which the discussions are to be had today. But more importantly, Madam Presiding Officer, we said less than 14 months ago that we were insisting upon creating, as it were, a hospitable but productive people. And that promise came against the background that there would be an exemption of none, an exclusion of nobody. Madam Presiding Officer, we would have gone as far as come to this great house to enact the Tobago Community Action Model, which gave life and buoyancy to community groups and interests within our societies, so as to ensure that we continue to interact with them, hear their pulse, hear their passions, hear their concerns, and treat strategically with those things that affect them most. Madam Presiding Officer, in addition to which, we would have made true on our promise to establish broad-based committees. We would have made true on our promise to ensure that the whole process of collaboration and public consultative processes are well attended so that our people can hear from us, we can interact with them, and they can hold us true to legitimate expectations. Madam Presiding Officer, it is against this background that I am very, very pleased to be a part of today's debate, because it speaks to our next fundamental area of service delivery based on the promises given and assured to the Tobagonian people. And I am proud to be a part of that. Madam Presiding Officer, before I jump into the crux of the matter, let me just clarify something for the record. The member, I almost said honorable, the member opposite, let your record show that. The member opposite said that we didn't need to come here to discuss this thing, that we could have met with him in James Park, the same arena where he tried to be more shepherd than the psalmist David and paraded himself up and down the place with a set of sheep. He said that we could have come there and have agreements and the likes and not waste Tobago's people's time. Madam Presiding Officer, this is the same member who staged a walk out of the house when we tried to agree upon the establishment of a code of conduct. How can we take his word? How can we rest assured in the suggestions and the articulations being made when in truth and in fact one is not even guided by a principle or by a code of ethics? We therefore are left with no other choice but to come to the house to debate Tobago's people's business. Madam Presiding Officer, the Division of Community Development, Enterprise Development and Labor, of which I am the Assistant Secretary and proud to be a part of that administrative family, continues to work hand in hand with community groups and interests, Madam Presiding Officer, to give ear and attention to the needs of communities at the level of the individual, the family, the society, and this half of the national community. Madam Presiding Officer, we have gone as far to empower community organizations such as village councils, religious bodies, NGOs, other FBOs, and the likes, Madam Presiding Officer, giving them an opportunity to recognize in themselves that they are a part of the governance structure and that their contribution is important to the work that we do and the quality representation and service delivery that we want to deliver to the people of Tobago. We have done that, Madam Presiding Officer, because we insist on this side of the divide that all our peoples matter and that we will govern them equally and equitably. But what was evident from our consultations, Madam Presiding Officer, is that there is in fact a pervasive and prevailing culture, one that speaks in one respect to a kind of inclusion, but one that also looks down upon persons who are differently abled. And this is the culture we want to remedy. Because while the Tobagonian people, by their very nature, are a hospitable people, while by our exertions as it pertains to industry and labor, we are a productive people, and yes, more can be done and better can be accomplished. We also are a people who engender a sense of sensitivity and sensibility because of the out factor and not because of who we are based on nature. Madam Presiding Officer, I'm saying that only to say that sometimes our reaching out to persons, especially those who are differently abled, is because we feel how about them. They make us feel how. Sometimes we feel sorry, sometimes we feel empathy. Sometimes we are saying, Madam Presiding Officer, that the time has come to establish a broad-based, special-purpose, special select committee that will ensure that policies and principles are well constituted so that all people can be properly educated and all peoples can benefit from a culture of inclusivity here in beautiful Tobago, the paradise or capital of paradise. Madam Presiding Officer, I want to quote from an article on Educating for a Sustainable Future, a transdisciplinary vision of concerted action, paragraph 111 to 112 from UNESCO. And it says, Madam Presiding Officer, our culture includes our whole systems of beliefs, values, attitudes, customs, and institutions. It shapes our gender, race, and other social relations and affects the way we perceive ourselves and the world and how we interact with other people and the rest of nature. To the extent that the global crisis facing humanity is a reflection of collective values and lifestyles, it is, above all, a cultural crisis. Culture, therefore, the article continues, has a central place in the complex notion of sustainability, and whatever form the future takes, it will be shaped at the local level by a mosaic of cultures that surround the globe and which contribute to the decisions that each country, community, household, and individual makes. Madam Presiding Officer, all of that comes down to say that we have a responsibility as the central administration of the Tobago House of Assembly. We have a responsibility as our leaders to ensure, Madam Presiding Officer, that we work hand in hand with other community agencies, individuals, Madam Presiding Officer, to create a culture of inclusion, a culture of inclusivity. You see, Madam Presiding Officer, I have very close friends who are differently abled. And I would call one's name because he gave permission so to do. A good friend of mine, Stephon Charles. He is confined to a wheelchair. He was not born that way. In fact, it was an accident that led to him being confined to a wheelchair. And Stephon said to me one day, he said, one of the reasons why I love you so much is because you have never pitied my position, pitied my complaints. And the reason why I was never able to do that, Madam Presiding Officer, is because I saw him as a human person. I saw him as no different to me because we have more in common than we do uncommon. And that while he may have some confinements to a wheelchair that would limit mobility and the likes, I recognize in myself that I have limitations as well that speak essentially to who I am as a human person. And that is reflected in each and every one of us. So don't run off very quickly to say that Shomari has a disability. That is present in all of us. Examine the self. But Madam Presiding Officer, one of the things he told me, in fact, is that we need to ensure as government and as leaders that we do all that is within our powers to ensure that the differently able in society has a fair shot at life. Madam Presiding Officer, I'm suggesting to us today that we have done a tremendous good, that we have done a great lot as an administration to make true and to make good on our promises which we have intimated to the people of Tobago and to the national community, as it were. But we are also here, Madam Presiding Officer, for the establishment of a multidisciplinary, broad-based stakeholder committee because we recognize that with a little shift in priority, we can do further and we can go further and do better. We recognize, Madam Presiding Officer, that governments do not have all of the answers and that we need the community, that we need the church, that we need the family, that we need other institutions, Madam Presiding Officer, to continue to help us to sharpen and in one respect to purify our policies and our strategic directions so that all persons can benefit from our generosity as it pertains to good governance and responsible leadership. Madam Presiding Officer, as an assembly, as a division, as a local and national community, we are applying, Madam Presiding Officer, this ethics as it pertains to the way in which we develop images of sustainable futures that are culturally appropriate and locally relevant. The great diversity of our cultures around the world means that there will be many versions of what a sustainable future might be. That in various localities and in different forms, sustainability will reflect differently based on the values, the aspirations, the expectations, the resources, and the abilities, including aptitudes of our people. That, Madam Presiding Officer, despite these differences, there are at least 3 common trends that run through the global consciousness and the global thinking about sustainable futures that speak for inclusion of all types of peoples. And these are, Madam Presiding Officer, thinking about forever, being first among them. And this is important to me only because it suggests to us that while based on our spiritual beliefs and our religious perspectives, we do not all agree that we will be on earth forever, I should say, that, Madam Presiding Officer, we have to think of forever as a possible destination, a certain kind of future. You see, Madam Presiding Officer, when we think of forever, we must think that we must begin to put things in place to minimize and mitigate against these challenges that affect persons that result in them being differently abled. That, Madam Presiding Officer, that while we will never be able to treat with all of the biological, all of the psychological, all of the social factors that impact upon pregnant mothers and upon families and even dare to say pregnant husbands, pregnant fathers. Madam Presiding Officer, that we must begin to put things in place to ensure that we provide avenues and areas by which persons can lead healthy, productive, and progressive lives, thinking about forever. Madam Presiding Officer, that has been made evident in the Grow Tobago, Eat Tobago program or campaign which we have started and which I would wish to invite members opposite to be a part of, most especially since we are also your leaders and we care about you. Madam Presiding Officer, secondly, the whole process of learning. Because when we think about the differently abled, oftentimes we think about access to institutions, access to public spaces, accessibility, access relative to communication and information, and the likes, Madam Presiding Officer. We even go as far as thinking, and quite rightly so, about the different types of intelligences and how we interact with those. But, Madam Presiding Officer, we are saying that we must think more closely about the process of learning, because in a generous Tobago, the 21st century classroom must be concerned with empowering and educating all peoples, barring disabilities. The third leg of this, Madam Presiding Officer, is a dynamic balance. A dynamic balance. And I want to pride myself in talking about that dynamic balance, because what it suggests is that no man is an island. And that if we are to really champion the kinds of changes which we want to see to empower and improve the quality of our people's lives, Madam Presiding Officer, there must be balance in the way we govern our systems and manage our affairs. That no one individual should assume divine right or total power to determine the course of anybody else's future. And so we are very happy that we are in the company of those persons for whom this policy is directed, because we wish that they would be a part of the process. You see, Madam Presiding Officer, as a young man, I was the last of my parents' 5 children. And while I do not wish for everybody to have intimate knowledge about me, I said that only to make the point that decisions were made for me, but not with me, as a young man. You see, I happen to grow up in an age where little children must be seen and not heard. But, Madam Presiding Officer, we are pushing the bars. Madam Presiding Officer, we are challenging the status quo, because now we are saying that everybody must have a voice and that their particular concerns must be attended with dignity and with a spirit of humanity. We want to hear your concerns too. Madam Presiding Officer, while it is arguable that none of us will be exact in our assumptions of what the future will be, except that it would be very different from life as we know it today, decisions about whether that future is a sustainable one or not will depend upon changes to human culture, the home culture, the individual culture that shape and define the mental spaces, the religious cultures. Because oftentimes we see, and it is evident in our landscape, in our national community, that oftentimes religious leaders use religion as a wedge to separate society, playing upon the affective and spiritual domains of people, the cognitive domains, to divide us, But we are saying, Madam Presiding Officer, that in as much as we love this whole concept of a side-by-side we stand Twin Island Republic, we are going to do all that we can to ensure that the differently abled are not left behind. That we must challenge workplace cultures and good governance and practices as a culture. Madam Presiding Officer, developing an understanding of the emerging concepts of a sustainable development for our people is one of the major focus of the Division of Community Development, Enterprise Development and Labor. UNESCO defines sustainable development as, and I quote, development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Madam Presiding Officer, through our Vocation Skills Program, we continue to provide resources, facilities, avenues, and opportunities for persons to recognize and realize their full potentials without compromising that of others. Madam Presiding Officer, that in this division, we recognize and acknowledge ourselves as being the hub around which Tobago's further development will be centered. And as a result, we continue to extend the olive branch of peace, the hand of partnership to various divisions, various governmental agencies, various non-governmental agencies to continue to work together, to partner, and to collaborate in constructing the kind of future that we want to see at the level of the community. Madam Presiding Officer, this administration acknowledges that the interdependent links between environment and sustainable development are not simply conversations of economics, but also include a concern for issues such as human rights, population, social development, equity and equality, housing, food security, gender, and equal opportunity that are also important to the thrust. And so even in that, I want to take the time to commend my CPEP brothers and sisters who are presently engaged in a district cleanup campaign drive because they understand that the environment is an enabling factor in persons recognizing their full potential. And we want to ensure that the environment is such that it accommodates and it affords even the differently able the opportunity to navigate that environment in a manner that is consistent with their humanity. And so, Madam Presiding Officer, I sat there listening to the member opposite, and I couldn't help but be reminded of a poem that we all know, Desiderata. Go placidly among the noise and the haste, and remember what peace there be in silence. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all people. Speak your truth quietly and listen to others. Even the dull and the ignorant, they too have their story. Madam Presiding Officer, I couldn't resist the urge to quote that poem only because it suggests, Madam Presiding Officer, that we have to come to a place in our collective consciousness where we recognize that even when the view of the other is not what we would prefer firsthand, that we give occasion to hear those views, to dignify them, and to acknowledge their humanity. Madam Presiding Officer, I heard all kinds of talk about the Equals Opportunity Act, and it went as far as suggesting that all of Tobago within recent months would have been a disabled people because of the catastrophe that has become, as it were, the air and the sea bridges. I take great issue with that. I take great issue with that because it was said to the House over and over. It was articulated by the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. It has been purported on all social platforms, all media outlets. It has been purported that there was seldom ever, and I dare say never, an instance where the boat, as slow as it would have been trotting from Trinidad, came to Tobago at 100 capacity. That there was never even an instance, and very few instances, when it came to Tobago at 60% capacity. In other words, Madam Presiding Officer, the disability would have been on the individual level, if any, at all. And we do not at all seek on this side of the political divide to assume responsibility for that, because while the system may not have been at its best, it certainly was not a collapsed one. Madam Presiding Officer, the institution of this broad-based, multidisciplinary stakeholder committee provides an opportunity for the people of Tobago as part of the whole national community to start thinking about a comprehensive development framework and eventually to agree on a set of international development goals that cater to the specific needs of the differently abled. These take, Madam Presiding Officer, a holistic approach to development in which there is a balance between all dimensions of development: social, economic, political, and ecological. Madam Presiding Officer, the Division of Community Development, Enterprise Development, and Labor, just like the Division of Health, Wellness, Family Development, the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy, Youth Affairs, and Sport, all divisions across the Tobago House of Assembly, is determined to establish a dynamic balance between cultural differences and the emerging global ethic, which is a key component of educating for a sustainable future for all people. It reminds us that sustainability will be built from the actions of people and businesses within communities, and so that at all levels of society and extending outward in a spiral of shared understanding and revised and renewed visions, all differently able can be integrated into society and benefit from industry and commerce, from education and empowerment, from health, wellness, and family development, from sport and youth affairs, from innovation, from technology, and from spirituality. Madam Presiding Officer, we are saying that we are catering to the whole man, every man. But not just are we prepared, Madam Presiding Officer, to have what we call this dynamic balance among the dimensions and principles that underlie a sustainable future, but we have articulated, Madam Presiding Officer, dimensions of that sustainability: the ecological, the social, the economic, the political. But not just those dimensions, but the values related to those principles, Madam Presiding Officer: values of peace, equality, and equity, values of conservation, appropriate development, knowing that we are not where we want to be, but we have come quite a long way in the past 14 months, and we have certainly come a tremendous long way in the past 16 years. Madam Presiding Officer, the principles of democracy that allow for the inclusion of many voices, knowing very well that I am because we are. These principles mean that a sustainable future will be one in which all peoples care for each other and value social justice and peace. One in which we work together to protect natural systems and use resources wisely. One that values appropriate development and a satisfying livelihood for all people. And one that makes decisions through a fair and democratic process. Madam Presiding Officer, I wish to close by reminding persons that this committee supports a diverse approach to community development and family development as it pertains to new trends in family structures. That it supports the diversity of all persons and will support the diversity of all persons with different experiences, abilities, talents, and contributions. That this committee will seek to engender labor-related and social models for integration that remove barriers and empower participants and improve the quality of their life despite their differences. That this committee will engender a sense of equality of opportunity and treatment for all peoples, especially the differently abled, as it pertains to their ability to access employment that is becoming of their true potential. That, Madam Presiding Officer, this committee will work to ensure that there is a registry that we will be able to follow closely the progress of those who are differently abled in society, and in so doing, identify more closely with the fight to end discrimination that is levied against said individuals. That we would work towards the protection of our fundamental rights and freedoms for all peoples, and engender those policies by partnering with governmental and non-governmental agencies that protect against harassment, attacks, humiliations, and all other forms of assault. That we wish to support families to ensure quality care is provided at homes and businesses where equally high standard, high quality care can be delivered at the workplace, which will speak directly to a decent day's work for a decent day's pay. But more importantly, this committee would work to ensure, Madam Presiding Officer, that a people who are a proud Tobagonian people will identify, despite limitations, despite disabilities, as being a people who can be called a sound economic citizen that are both hospitable and productive. Madam Presiding Officer, we continue to extend the clarion call to all agencies, all organizations, all interest groups to join us in the fight of equality so as to ensure that everybody everywhere in this beautiful landmass that we call Tobago have access to a decent shot of life. And I thank you.
Councillor Dr. Faith B. Israel.
Good afternoon, Madam Presiding Officer. Good evening to the other members of the House and to those in our visiting gallery. Good evening to you. Today we meet again, and as the Minority Councillor indicated, I also believe that this is sort of a waste of state's time because we really do not need to debate this. As a result, I will be pretty quick because there are a couple points that I particularly want to raise if we are going to do this, and we're going to do this comprehensively. The first point I want to look at has to do with the idea of the definition of somebody who is living with disabilities. Now, I got a copy, thanks to the communications unit of the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development. I got a copy of the national policy, the draft national policy on persons with disabilities, and I thank the communications office for that. Now, I specifically looked at that document because one of the things that was raised when I was preparing for this motion was, what is the definition of somebody who is disabled? What are the various types of disabilities that we are talking about? Because if we are going to put together the committee, and the committee is going to, in essence, move towards a policy, a position paper, a local policy, and that registry, we need to know exactly what it is that we are talking about. Who are the people we are targeting, for want of a better word? So, Madam Presiding Officer, I decided to look a little closely at the various kinds of disabilities and the definitions that we need to pay very close attention to. There is a World Health Organization system that classifies disabilities, and it uses three specific terms. We speak about impairment, we speak about disability, and then we speak about handicap. And I would spend a little time talking about each of those. Madam Presiding Officer, the term impairment, according to this classification system, means, and I quote, any loss or abnormality of psychological, physiological, or anatomical structure or function. In other words, we mean anything that affects the structure or function of the body, so that it is not classified as quote-unquote normal. This may be as a result of accidents, this may be because the person was born like that, genetics or other issues. And according to that system, that classification system, there are 9 specific categories of impairment. And Madam Presiding Officer, I will outline those because we continually speak about disability in Trinidad and Tobago as if we are only speaking about those with physical disabilities. Now, sometimes we may include those with developmental disabilities, but that is not the sum total, and we need to be clear about that. So these include intellectual, and these are those relating to thinking, memory, and of course, when we think of the traditional mental retardation and so forth. There's another category, includes other psychological impairments, and those includes people with issues relating to perception, attention, emotions, and so forth. There are language impairments, and those include people who are unable to understand communication, the different communication methods, who are unable to speak, and so forth. We have oral, A-U-R-A-L, impairment, and that includes those relating to hearing loss. But it also includes those who have issues with balance, because if you recognize, the air has a great deal to do with how we are able to balance ourselves. We have ocular impairment, that includes those relating to your eyes, visceral impairment, which refers to those relating to the internal organs, those that we do not see, those that we may not be able to recognize at face value, gastrointestinal issues, reproductive issues, all of those. We speak about skeletal impairment, which includes our limbs, arms, and so forth. Disfiguring impairments, which refers to those that disfigure the different parts of the body. Those may be a little more obvious for you to see. And then there is another category, which is sort of a generalized section, which includes things like failure to thrive. It includes issues relating to malnutrition, some blood disorders, things like headaches and uncontrollable itching, and so forth. Madam Presiding Officer, the other term, so those are the impairments, and there is a link. The other term I would like us to look very carefully at is the term disability. And according to that WHO classification system, a disability is any restriction or lack which results from any of the impairments that I recently spoke about, that makes it difficult to perform an activity in the manner or within the normal ranges considered for human beings. In other words, Madam Presiding Officer, if the impairment that we outlined before now causes you to not be able to function normally, quote unquote, within society, then it is classified as a disability. And there are several. I won't go through all of the categories. There are 9 categories, but just to let you know, it includes behavioral, communication, personal care, meaning we're unable to dress ourselves and so forth, body disposition, which includes things like reaching, kneeling, that kind of movement that is needed. And I would highlight the one specifically that refers to the world of work. Dexterity, those that relate to gripping and allowing us to use our legs and so forth comfortably. Situational, and that is important because situational refers to those people who, because of the impairment above, may not be able to withstand certain noises, certain degrees of light, certain temperatures, and so forth. And there are those that are in the classic category of particular skills, and those refer to things like critical thinking, things like being able to cooperate with other people, tidiness, and those things. Now, I highlight those because, Madam Presiding Officer, if we are talking about a resolution that is going to create a multidisciplinary stakeholder committee to prepare a position paper with an emphasis of inclusion of differently abled workplace in the work of differently abled persons in the workplace of Tobago, we need to ensure that we do it as comprehensively as possible and not just focus on the disabilities that we traditionally think about. Madam Presiding Officer, the final word in that classification system is what is known as handicap. Handicap is defined as a disadvantage for a given individual that limits or prevents the fulfillment of a role that is normal. A disadvantage for a given individual that limits or prevents the fulfillment of a role that is normal. And that, Madam Presiding Officer, is where we come in. It is where we come in. Because this is where governments, this is where companies, this is where the society has to ensure that it creates spaces that does not force someone who may be disabled to then be handicapped. Because we know that individuals who are disabled may be able to function normally if the right provisions have been put in place to do so. And that, Madam Presiding Officer, is where I would like us to take this kind of discussion. We can't use the old way of thinking about it. We can't use the just looking at the locomotor types of disabilities. We have to be way more comprehensive to ensure that our workplaces, to ensure that everywhere, the streets, the schools, are actually able to facilitate people who are disabled, and not just those who are disabled using the very narrow definitions that we are used to using. Madam Presiding Officer, as I talk about that, please allow me to then move on to the second point, which is a distinction between accessibility, which in essence is what most people have been talking about, and the concept known as reasonable accommodation. Accessibility is simple. That speaks to having access to spaces. So, Madam Presiding Officer, it includes, and I'm going to use some specific current examples, ensuring that we have ramps so that people can enter buildings unassisted, ensuring that there are elevators available, and we are quick to say sometimes that the building has an elevator, but we have to be conscious of the fact that if there are a couple steps to get to the elevator, someone who may be wheelchair bound may not be able to access the elevator. So we have to think about this holistically. And as I said before, when we're talking about access, we mean unassisted access. Because I know for very long, at the current office of the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development, and at the old office, there are officers who are wheelchair bound and could not have accessed the office space because there was no way to get to the conference room or no way to get to the meeting room that happened to be upstairs. Madam Presiding Officer, there are also little things. For example, if we say there is an elevator, then the elevator needs to be open and easily accessible all the time. And some people should not have keys that prevent other people from getting into the elevators. Madam Presiding Officer, things like toilet facilities,
And again, we go back to this is all part of the definition of access. So we may have a toilet, but to get to the toilet, there is a step up or a step down. If you look at practically all of the toilets in this building, there is some step up or step down to get to it. And even if there isn't a step up or a step down to get to it, you have to then look at the size of the toilet, the size of the stall. Can someone who is wheelchair bound get in, get themselves onto the toilet unaccompanied, unassisted, maneuver within the space unassisted, and be able to function normally? So we have to think about it comprehensively. What about disabled parking? Now, we all know that disabled parking is something that is quite obvious. It needs to be closest to the entrance, or at least closest to the entrance where there is a ramp, and so forth. But we currently have situations, for example, Madam Presiding Officer, where members of staff, senior members of staff, who are not disabled, have been parking in the spaces that have been designated for disabled individuals. And when those people raise a fuss, when it's been highlighted, instead of doing the honorable thing and creating more spaces for those who are disabled, what they do is paint over the disabled sign and change the title of the space, not being conscious and not being cognizant of the fact that that space was placed there for a specific reason, not for the convenience of the most senior officer, but for the convenience of the disabled members of staff. Now, those are examples of accessibility, where we talk about access to the space. They are generalized. But, Madam Presiding Officer, I would like us to spend a little bit more time, and I would like us to commit at this Tobago House of Assembly to doing more than just creating accessibility, but moving towards having reasonable accommodation. And reasonable accommodation refers to having individualized adjustments to the work environment in response to the specific needs of the worker. Now, that would ensure that, for example, our contracts that may include some non-essential services or some non-essential functions for someone who we've identified as disabled, who may not be able to fulfill those non-essential functions. We can remove those from the contracts and not use those against the individuals at their appraisal points later. It may also include making special provisions at the workspace. And let me give some examples, Madam Presiding Officer. For someone who may have rheumatoid arthritis, yes, and something that we talk about, something that a lot of people have, but we don't classify it as a disability the way we think of disabilities. You may need to adjust the contract time for that person and allow that person to have probably shorter working days, to have possibly a 70 or 80% full-time contract, and have that still be classified as full-time employment for that person. Somebody who may have an intellectual disability, you may pair them with another co-worker who is able to assist them, who is able to monitor, who is able to mentor them, who is able to assist with decision-making and certain tasks while on the job. For a pregnant worker who may be having severe morning sickness in the first trimester, you may have something as simple as altered working hours, so they don't have to be at work for 8 o'clock in the middle of the morning sickness. Or you may allow that worker to stay at home and work from home during those hours. These are all examples of accommodation, reasonable accommodation. And that is where the world is leading as it relates to ensuring that we have the kind of inclusiveness that we claim to be talking about. The bottom line is, Madam Presiding Officer, that if we are talking about inclusiveness, and if we are talking about equity, and if we are talking about ensuring that everyone is able to benefit from being at work, able to benefit from all of the provisions that we provide, we need to go way beyond just equality, because equality may not bring equity. And reasonable accommodation moves way beyond simply thinking about making spaces accessible for people with disabilities. Now, Madam Presiding Officer, I was, like the minority leader, I also looked at this motion and thought, another committee? Okay. And I sincerely hope that those of us who are here speaking are not just doing this to provide lip service to people who really need us to function. Because we have on too many occasions formed these grandiose committees and had these instrument-giving ceremonies, had beautiful pictures, placed them on Facebook and so forth. And shortly after, when you ask, what has that committee done thus far, the answer is, I don't know, or possibly nothing. Madam Presiding Officer, we stood here, we sat here, we debated 2 months ago to have a committee to deal with the very important issue of the Tobago Autonomy Bill. It is 2 months later. We had a non-starter of a meeting, and that committee has gone nowhere since. Madam Presiding Officer,
Madam Presiding Officer, as a member of the Forum of Political Parties, I would like to indicate that what the member is imputing is actually false, and that overtures have been made to the minority, in particular to the minority assemblyman, to meet on matters regarding the very committee that's formed by the members of this assembly.
Madam Presiding Officer, I am speaking about the committee that the 13th Assembly sitting created. We voted on a special select committee. We had what we thought should have been a meeting shortly after that agreement. At that meeting, there was an understanding that it needed to be convened, and the individuals who needed to convene it officially were not there. And if there have been meetings since then, I have not been informed. I have been selected to be a member of that committee. So we have had no meetings of that select committee since we agreed and since we voted on it 2 months ago, Madam Presiding Officer. And there are other committees, Madam Presiding Officer, that have been formed. Research Ethics, Facilities Review Committee for Homes for Older Persons, Facilities Review Committee for Homes for Children, specifically under the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development. These committees were formed, they were given their instrument of appointment in May 2017. It is now a year later, and I am wondering, Madam Presiding Officer, what have those committees done? Where are they? Have those committees actually functioned the way they should have? It is a year later, Madam Presiding Officer. And the last thing I would like to talk about very quickly is the fact that we are talking about having a register for individuals who are differently abled. And I was hoping to get a sense of what this register is supposed to do, and maybe the following speakers would answer that question. Where are we going with this register? Why are we collecting that kind of information? Is it that we want social support services to ensure that they are meeting the needs of all of their clients? And if that is the case, then I am sure the social support agents have lists of all of their clients. Is it for disaster preparedness? Because, Madam Presiding Officer, I know that TEMA already had a very clear definition of disabled, and they have actually gone out and created a list of disabled individuals within their communities for disaster response matters. So I would like to get a clearer understanding of what really is this register supposed to do. Because one of the comments that I got when doing research for this was the fact that we need to be careful that we do not create these kinds of registers and identify people which can then lead to discrimination of those people if we are not clear about the rules and regulations and parameters of these kinds of registers. Madam Presiding Officer, I am very glad that the speaker before me spoke so candidly and was very clear about the fact that the Tobago House of Assembly needs to be the agency that pushes the kind of inclusivity that we are talking about. And I hope and I pray that what comes out of this is not just the lip service that we've gotten for the longest time, and that they will actually act accordingly to ensure that all of the needs of all of the citizens on this beautiful island of Tobago are taken care of. Madam Presiding Officer, I thank you.
Assistant Secretary in the Office of the Chief Secretary, Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer, and of course I rise to my feet to make my contribution, of course, to the motion as tabled by the Secretary of Health, Wellness, and Family Development, Councillor Dr. Agatha Carrington. And good afternoon, of course, to my colleagues. Madam Presiding Officer, the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations General Assembly of 2015 and embraced by the government of Trinidad and Tobago set out the targets that should be met by, of course, the year 2030. The Trinidad and Tobago government understands and adheres to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals outlined by the United Nations, and the first whereas draws our attention to these sustainable goals. My focus today will be on goal number 4, of course, which deals with quality education for all. And I would like to read, it says that quality education for all by the year 2030, we must work towards encouraging our youth and adults who have relevant skills, including technical and vocational skills for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship. By 2030, we must work towards ensuring all have access to an education on all levels, regardless of age, gender, abilities, etc. The Secretary of Health, Wellness, and Family Development alluded to these goals of the SDGs, and of course, we at the Division of Education, in keeping with goal number 4, has a mandate and a target to provide basic quality education to all, from preschool to the secondary level. The government of Trinidad and Tobago, in addition to the agreement of the Sustainable Development Goal 4, has been a participant of what we call the DACA Framework for Action. And a few of these goals are: 1, expanding and improving comprehensive early childhood care and education, especially for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged of children; ensuring that all children, with special emphasis on girls, including the poorest, working children, and children with needs, complete a good quality primary education; And finally, of course, ensuring that the learning needs of all young people are met through equitable access to appropriate learning and life skill programs. Madam Presiding Officer, as a student of sociology, the functionalists will always tell you, and they purport that school is a miniature version of society. I believe, Madam Presiding Officer, that the school should become the training ground, the place where inclusion of the differently abled begins and, of course, transcends into the workplace. The place where the goals, as outlined above, begin to take shape and are operational. Hence, our mission at the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy is to provide an environment that promotes and supports holistic development and lifelong learning through relevant, innovative, and well-conceived educational, sporting, and youth-oriented programs, thus enabling all persons to achieve their full potential as productive citizens. Madam Presiding Officer, the concepts of a peaceful and inclusive society, as mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course our mission at the Division, can only be realized if, as a society, we divert from all traditional modes of thinking and, of course, acting. Madam Presiding Officer, as a people, to know and to understand where we are going, we must understand our history. And during my research on this motion, I discovered a lot. And I would like, of course, for you to permit me a moment to share and to add a little on the history of persons with disabilities. And I know my colleagues before, Dr. Agatha and Assemblyman Shumari Hector shared. But permit me to share a little that I found as I researched. Gordon, Tantillo, Feldman, and Peronel, in 2004, they wrote, "The history of disability in Europe and other parts of the world is replete with evidence of violation of human rights and beliefs that persons with disabilities were contaminants and threats to an otherwise pure human species." They go on to write, Madam Presiding Officer, "Many persons with disabilities were murdered and used as objects of entertainment, and the common belief was that society and persons with disabilities needed to protect themselves from each other." Canon 1964 wrote that during the 15th century, private philanthropic organizations in Europe began, of course, to establish schools for persons with sensory impairments. Canon notes that the curriculum sought to develop vocational skills, and this was a stark difference from what existed in the regular schools. I move closer to home, and I'm going to talk about the history of Trinidad and Tobago. And when I researched, it was noted that oral history indicates that Trinidad and Tobago followed this example that was noted by Canna, and evidence of this still holds for today. For example, this society assigns specific tasks to some persons with disabilities. The Trinidad and Tobago Society expects persons who are blind to weave and to make baskets. Many assign cooking, sewing, or housekeeping to persons who are deaf. However, in an inclusive setting, all students must pursue the same general curriculum. Madam Presiding Officer, in the Caribbean, there is evidence of negative societal attitudes in some countries. In Guyana, for example, society does not think that students with disabilities should have access to general education. Stories indicate that some Caribbean persons fear persons with disabilities. For example, relatives and friends thought it unwise to work at a special school while pregnant. Apart from believing that disabilities are contagious, many think that persons with disabilities can harm them. This indicates that there is a limited understanding and awareness of the nature of disability. At the recently held Hidden Disabilities Conference in Trinidad, Dr. David Bratt, who is a Trinidadian-based pediatrician with over 37 years of public and private practice of pediatric care at the hospital and university level, in response to a question in the question and answer segment, mentioned that there was a period in Trinidad and Tobago's history when children were being treated at the Port of Spain General Hospital for marasmus. Sadly, their parents took them for ritual cleansing and they died during the practice. Madam Presiding Officer, I say to you, this is the extent to which traditions and beliefs can cloud our thought processes, judgments, and impede our progress as a people. I know all of you sitting around this horseshoe can think of examples of the one that was mentioned by Dr. Bratt. But as I was researching, I had to have conversation with experts. And one of the experts that I spoke to and with was Dr. Joan Bob Ward. And of course, you know she's a Tobagonian. And she stated that from an extensive research in Tobago and elsewhere, she discovered that there exists what she calls an eclectic model of disability in Tobago. In her own words, and I want to quote her at this time, she says that a significant finding in her study is the existence of 3 models of disability among stakeholders. These models can be located within international conversations on persons with disabilities. They include the medical model, which has its genesis in the early history of persons with disabilities, the religious model, and the social model that later emerged and influenced the worldwide move toward inclusive education. Her work gives an explanation of each model, and in the interest of time, I would share briefly. The medical model of disability views disability as a problem that belongs to the individual with the disability, who should then assume full responsibility for the difficulties associated with the disability. Madam Presiding Officer, she goes on to say, it ascribes causation to injury, disease, or other health conditions which require rehabilitation or treatment. The social model of disability is an inclusive approach that distinguishes impairment from disability and views the environment as the disabling factor. Madam Presiding Officer, the religious model, as she explains, bears themes which embrace conceptions of sin or sanctity, care and compassion, burden and healing, wholeness and impurity, and weakness and undesirability. Dr. Bob Ward further stated, this study revealed a peculiar marriage of the medical, religious, and social models of disability that she has labeled, as I said before, the eclectic model. She shares that stakeholders' perspectives on inclusive education and their beliefs and practices about disability contradict the ideals of inclusive education. The perspectives have presented valuable guidelines on ways to promote this initiative and move the society from elitism to inclusion. However, Madam Presiding Officer, as she said, these stakeholders promote an eclectic model of disability, which is a combination of the medical, social, and religious models. These models, particularly the medical and social models, contradict each other. There is therefore no one solid philosophical stance with which stakeholders would approach inclusive education if there is not urgent, successful intervention that targets attitude. Madam Presiding Officer, I am saying to you, the only thing that is constant in this world is change, and for the differently abled, change must come. Change is necessary. The promotion of a peaceful and inclusive society can be realized only when we as a people understand the challenge. We are radical enough to make a difference, and we recognize and make the groups in society, such as those with disabilities, our dropouts or out-of-school children, and our vulnerable boys and girls, no longer feel afraid, ashamed, and disempowered. The feelings of uncertainty, Madam Presiding Officer, about their future must be a thing of the past. Beliefs and practices need to change if we are to foster a spirit of inclusion, reduce inequalities in the education system, promote peace, and realize any of the goals outlined above. Madam Presiding Officer, I draw your attention to the whereas, the second whereas. And the government of Trinidad and Tobago has demonstrated its commitment to education for all by signing on to the relevant treaties and conventions and developing the policies that directly address inclusive education. This include, 1, the Ministry of Education Strategic Plan 2002 to 2006, the Education Policy Paper 1993 to 2003, the Draft Policy on Special Education for 2004, the Student Support Services Discussion Paper on Inclusive Education 2004, the Ministry of Education Strategic Action Plan 2011 to 2015, and the Draft National Standard for Education 2006. An evaluation of the Tobago School for the Deaf, Speech, and Language Impaired was conducted, Madam Presiding Officer, and a document was presented by the committee that was charged with responsibility for doing the evaluation, and of course, attached to that document are recommendations for improvements. Madam Presiding Officer, the then Division of Education, Youth Affairs, and Sport, in response, of course, to education for all, youth with disabilities, and a drive towards inclusive education, developed a special evaluation implementation plan, and that document I have in my possession. The document, of course, speaks to policy directive for early childhood to post-education into adulthood. It speaks to awareness and sensitization. It speaks to data collection. It speaks to advertisements and press releases. It speaks to committees and their structure. It speaks to service delivery. It speaks to interdivisional service coordination. It speaks to screening and evaluation and much, much more. At the level of the Ministry of Education and the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy, the policy framework has been developed. Madam Presiding Officer, all over the world, NGOs and all other interested stakeholders grapple with ways to reduce inequalities and inclusion of the differently abled and the vulnerable. There are countless research papers, projects, programs, and best practices that point the way forward. All this information serves to guide and provide strategic direction to this administration and those in managerial positions. All of this is in an effort to ensure that our citizens transition from school to the workforce and add value to the island of Tobago and our twin island republic. Madam Presiding Officer, members of this House, the foundation has been laid and the information is available. The Secretary of Education and the team that he leads recognizes the enormity of this inclusive education of the differently abled. We understand that it requires more than improvements to the physical infrastructure of school buildings. It means provision of modern teaching aids and resources, staffing, etc. The public is assured that the Division of Education will work diligently to meet the needs of our differently abled and, of course, to ensure education is accessible to all. Madam Presiding Officer, let us go to whereas number 3. The Tobago House of Assembly, through the Division of Education, Youth Affairs, and Sports, and now the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy, has provided support directly and indirectly to the differently able Tobagonian, the out-of-school children, the vulnerable, and those with special needs. The division has over the years assisted in the following. 1, back-to-school assistance to needy students. 2, funding of assistive devices like glasses and hearing aids. 3, psychosocial assessments of students, and of course, we give referrals to the Division of Health. Individual and group intervention where necessary. Sponsorship and assistance to conferences, workshops, seminars, sporting activities, and trips. You can remember the Down Syndrome Day conference that was just held, and of course, the Tobago leg of the Special Olympics. We also prepare individual educational plans. We provide transportation. We provide nutrition. We give meals. We provide staffing and curriculum planning. Of course, we provide provision of teachers and nursing aides. We have the introduction of the technical vocational tracking program for students scoring under 30% in the C exam. And there is an initiative to have the Police Youth Club, intervention as part of the rehabilitation of our young people. We have certificate training of our elementary school teachers. There was training of 40 teachers in the area of intellectual disabilities and autism spectrums. In 2005, the Tobago House of Assembly had its first annual professional development workshops in areas such as best practices in instructional delivery, behavior management, intervention strategies, and learning disabilities. The Division of Education partners with the Division of Health to provide free screening for vision and hearing. There has been introduction of the construction certificate training program in masonry, carpentry, plumbing, and electrical at the Roxborough Trade Center. We have training for early childhood teachers in areas of early identification and intervention strategies. And this is necessary to plan for students who display developmental delays in speech, language, and behavior. I move on, Madam Presiding Officer. The Teacher Professional Center at Marden House recently opened, serves as a place where teachers can meet, plan, research, and collaborate. It is open to all early childhood teachers, primary, secondary, and special education teachers. The ongoing instructional coaches program at our primary schools has been taking place, as I said before. The assessment of the students has been administered, and the results will allow us to see the gaps in the system, identify our vulnerable students, and plan effectively to meet the needs of these very students. Madam Presiding Officer, service, performance, and delivery beats all talk anytime. The PNM, this PNM administration is here to deliver, and of course, to deliver more. Madam Presiding Officer, I move on to whereas number 4. Madam Presiding Officer, we have learned from the past, and as an administration, we are looking to the future. We want to make our schools accessible to the differently abled, the vulnerable, and the disadvantaged of children. We begin, of course, Madam Presiding Officer, with the soon-to-be completed Scarborough RC Primary School, which will be equipped with elevators and ramps. When the new Scarborough Secondary School, and of course the School for the Deaf, Hearing, and Language Impaired, and our 5 early childhood centers are constructed under this PNM administration, there will be institutions like no other. Madam Presiding Officer, the PNM administration in our manifesto told the people of Tobago that we are going to stimulate schools to deliver quality education. The division will soon initiate the I Love My School project. This island-wide competition will involve the participation of our 39 primary schools, our 9 secondary schools, and our 2 special education schools. This project has been designed to arouse an awareness of and appreciation for the school environment and its importance in the child's development. The I Love You School project, Madam Presiding Officer, members of this House, seeks, of course, to encourage our students to take ownership of their school environment and defend it against negative influences. Secondly, it has been designed to foster camaraderie and team spirit among our students. And thirdly, cultivate strong partnerships and bonds among stakeholders like the parents and, of course, the community. And fourth, stimulate the inner creative abilities of our students by tapping into their various strengths and abilities. As we continue to look to the future, Madam Presiding Officer, we will continue as a division to train our staff and our teachers. Of course, in July of this year, Madam Presiding Officer, the division brings to Tobago the Young Innovators Camp. This is an initiative of the Innovation Unit of the Division of Education, Innovation, and Energy. The camp aims to, 1, provide a stimulus for innovation practices among our island's youth. 2, of course, aid in the positioning of Tobago as a major player in programming and application development. Madam Presiding Officer, participants of these camps will be drawn from all the schools here on the island. In December, Madam Presiding Officer, the division delivers to the people of Tobago an innovation fair. And of course, we are going to encourage all our schools to have innovation camps. Madam Presiding Officer, members of this House, the division is seeking to find and develop hidden talents, unused potential, and of course, innovators on this island of Tobago. And these must come from among our children here in Tobago. We continue, Madam Presiding Officer, to look ahead. The Division of Education, Innovation and Energy continues to partner with our sister and brother divisions. Working together, we continue our past efforts, and we continue and we will enhance our delivery. We aim, of course, in the future to incorporate financial literacy and entrepreneurial studies into the curriculum of our primary schools. We intend to promote enterprise, responsible risk-taking and innovation among our youths. We intend to develop programs that target our boys and our vulnerable groups in our society. If you remember, community development had a lovely thing when they recognized the World Day of the Boy Child. Some of the programs we tend to introduce, of course, are in areas of jewelry making, grooming of animals, caregiving, housekeeping, etc., etc. Last night, I had the privilege, I don't watch television very often, but I had the privilege of looking at TV6, and I saw a hearing impaired woman, and she was living a very active, successful, and satisfying life. And when I looked at it, you know, it drew my memory to the gentleman who was the featured keynote speaker at the Down Syndrome's conference, and of course, I like my calypso and my extempore, so I remembered lingo. And there are many others that we can think about as examples. But, Madam Presiding Officer, this PNM administration is on a mission. And the mission is from gate to the classroom and beyond. The sky is the limit for the differently abled in our society. As an administration, we understand the importance of inclusiveness of the differently abled in the education system. My colleague, Dr. Agatha, we agree with you at the division that for the differently abled, it is their right to be in the education system, and we guarantee you that we will do our part. Madam Presiding Officer, I draw near to the end, and we must remember that this is all our business. All of us have to play a role in this business of education and inclusiveness of the differently abled. I want to say thank you to all those that prepared the way, and as Assistant Secretary in the division, I will close with my secretary, and we will get the job done. The leadership and management of the division realizes that a holistic approach is necessary in this business of education if the transition of the differently abled and the vulnerable from school to the workplace is to take place effectively. And therefore, the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy registers its support for the motion as presented and further supports the establishment of a register of differently abled persons on the island of Tobago. I thank you.
Member for Palatuvia, Lansome, Speyside.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. Madam Presiding Officer, I wish to begin by acknowledging in particular, a member of the differently abled community who is with us in the public gallery. And I know Minority Leader spoke about having drivers who are differently able from his electoral district. But more than that, I wish to begin by highlighting him because I am one of those fortunate persons who from time to time will catch him as he will catch a car and catch a taxi to get transport to go home. And yes, he drives with efficiency, with speed, with technical astuteness, just as any other member of our society. And I believe that he is a living example of what can be done when we give folks who are differently able the opportunities, equal opportunity with everyone else. And I understand that he might be one of those who are struggling in terms of employment. And as folks have been talking about this motion. Folks have been talking about the need for equality in terms of employment. And if you look at the national draft policy that was released as of June 2017, you will see that employment is one of those areas that the draft policy speaks to. And I wish that those who would have unceremoniously ended his contract and so on, that they will give it a second thought, or for the very least work with him in terms of employment. But I felt it necessary to begin my contribution by highlighting him, because I think all of Tobago can learn a lot from his spirit and glory in his spirit. I wish to also say, Madam Presiding Officer, that the reality is Trinidad and Tobago is behind time when it comes to treating with the differently able. When we compare ourselves to other jurisdictions, there is a lot more that we could have done and should have done prior to now. And there's one thing that the Secretary bringing the motion said that I agree with, and it's strange that I do agree with her. But there's one thing she said that I agree with, and that is Tobago has an opportunity in this regard to lead the way in terms of our treatment of the differently abled. And I agree with her in that regard. The National Parliament could be behind us. They could be lax in how they move. But for us in Tobago, we must ensure that the Tobago space is one that is also known for being friendly and accommodating to those who are differently abled. And I'm saying that we are behind time because, quite frankly, all of the promises we heard from the member for Plymouth, Golden Lane, we have heard them before. It's not the first time we are hearing promises of new schools, of schools for the differently able. We have heard these promises for donkey years. In fact, we have been hearing them for the last 17 years, perhaps even more than that. And so, just repeating the promises, that in itself does little to comfort those who require delivery on these promises. And so we have to move to the point where we do more than just repeat the promises upon promises to the differently able and actually implement the things that we say we would implement. We are also behind because, Madam Presiding Officer, unfortunately, we have a culture across the island and perhaps across the Caribbean where we have not always treated and we don't always treat those who are differently abled with dignity. And I'm not just talking about how the government does things and those in governance do things. I'm talking about the ordinary citizens at the village level. If you should go through the villages and perhaps ask for some of the nicknames, the aliases for some of the folks who are differently abled, and you hear what sometimes we call each other, those nicknames that we call those who are differently abled, you will realize that we have a culture of making light the inabilities of those who weren't born or blessed to be as fortunate as we are. And that is something that we must address. And so in this motion, which seeks firstly for us to set up a committee, and I think those on the minority has been at pains to say we have to do more than just set up a committee. In fact, we wish the committee was set up a long time ago and we were debating the actual policy now. But that is not the case. And the reality is perhaps the policy should have been done prior to this incarnation of the Tobago House of Assembly. So we're now setting up the committee to get the broader policies done that will include the divisions that wouldn't have previously done some policy work as the Division of Education would have. But we have to look and, in fact, ask the committee, when this committee is formed, to really look at this from a very broad perspective And my colleague, Councillor Faith, tried to broaden the perspective in terms of how we define those who are differently abled, so that we don't miss folks. And we have to look at the component of public awareness as a part of that policy that will ultimately be written up. Because we have to find a way to change public culture, and that comes from public re-education. And so having public awareness as part of that eventual policy is critical. And it is also something that is in the draft national policy of June 2017. And having those public awareness campaigns will target not just the families, but will also target non-governmental organizations, other social institutions, because all of these entities have to play a role in accommodating, and more than that, giving our differently abled brothers and sisters, friends, family members, fellow villagers the same opportunities as we do. The next thing we must look at is that the THA must take inclusive education seriously. And a lot of what the Assistant Secretary spoke about in terms of inclusive education is there in writing. And I'll give an example of how sometimes what we have at the division level doesn't always filter down. Just last year, after the C examination, a mother from Pembroke called me and asked me to come and talk to her son. Her son failed the examination and did not want to return to school. So she was just looking for a male figure to talk to the young man. And when I went, I discovered that this young man was clinically diagnosed for having several learning disabilities, and he was having challenges. The parent could have shown me correspondence with the school, where she would have shared all this information with the school. She would have shared with the school the diagnosis, shared with the school the times that, and the schedule that he had to use to go for treatment and so on. And she shared how she had begged the school before to make the necessary applications so that for the exam, he will get the necessary exemptions, which are provided for in law and in the examination council. And the school did not do it. And on the day of graduation, coincidentally, that was also the same day that the results came out. And the other children laughed at him for failing, and so he did not want to return to school. And it shows how sometimes we do, in fact, might have the policy at the division level, but we have to find a way to have it filter down to those who must execute those policies. And that's another area we have to look at when we're drafting this policy paper. How do we ensure that it's implemented? That we don't have this committee meet, draft the policy, and then we pass it here, and then that's it. How do we ensure that it's executed? You see, we need this policy because I believe that this could assist us in changing how we interact with the differently able at every division. It will change how we see our industries. It will change how we go about distributing grants. And perhaps we'll look at the need for having different qualifications for those who are differently abled for some of these grants. The need for us to also anticipate that those who are differently able want to participate in the Tobago lifestyle, whatever that is, in its fullest form. And I heard somebody snickering when minority leaders spoke about access for the differently able to some of our tourism areas, when the reality is that that in itself could help boost that industry, and that in several places in the world, access is made to some of these areas. A more concerted effort to guarantee access is made for the differently able. And I could give you my own example of going to an area in Jamaica called Mayfield, where they have this waterfall. And I've always lamented that we don't have something similar here, where on the sides of the tiers of the waterfall we have well-constructed steps and so on, and railings and so on for people to get up. So those who are differently able can have access because they can hold on, they can walk, they can be assisted up, as opposed to us having a situation where most of our sites are meant to be traversed by those who are as fortunate as we are, who are sitting here. But there is an important point that I want to put on the table, which is that in us treating with the differently abled in a better way, we can essentially be giving them their independence. And most people who are differently able really just want their independence, their ability to do things on their own, to live on their own. And this is about affording to other human beings that sort of independence that we all take for granted. And the question is, how do we ensure that we do that? Now, the motion in and of itself doesn't contain all of this. The motion in and of itself contains two primary things, resolves two primary things. One, to set up the committee that will be broad, and I agree with that, to set up a committee that will consist of persons from from broad disciplines, and that is good, that is excellent. And the second thing is to create a registry so that we can be aware of those who are differently abled and those who are, and where they are, where they live, what their needs are, etc. I wish to add to that when we are doing our defining of the differently abled, let us insist on not being very narrow, as Councillor B. Israel spoke about, but ensuring that we widen it to include those areas of inabilities that we can't see with the naked eye. And we have to do better, because I have experienced from my own life that when you give folks who are differently abled the opportunity, equal opportunity, when you give them access, when you facilitate them, that they can sit with you in the same classrooms, they can sit the same exams with you, they can be professionals alongside you, and they can make an even greater contribution to the society just as you are. And that's what this is about. And so I join my colleagues in lending support to this motion. But we are saying, let this not go the way of other policy papers, because this is a country where policy papers go to die, where they end up on a shelf and become dusty, and that's it. Let's ensure that we follow up on this particular principle and policy that we're wishing to implement, and let us ensure that we execute it. Let's ensure that there is public awareness as part of the entire dynamic, because that is the only way we'll get sufficient buy-in, because we have to re-educate this island of Tobago. If we are honest, we have not always been kind to those who are differently abled. And so part of this must include re-educating the island of Tobago. And so I join with my colleagues on both sides as we get ready to pass this motion. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.
Secretary of Health, Wellness and Family Development.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I think today, the 24th of May, 2018, is a day in which all of Tobago will be well pleased, because on this day, we all agree on one thing. We all agree that there's a shared, and there is indeed a shared concern by all of us, notwithstanding our, and I don't want to say sides, notwithstanding or various thoughts that there is limited inclusiveness of the differently abled. We agree about the provision of an enabling environment for the differently abled. We agree that this committee, when set up, should comprise broad disciplines. We agree that there's a need for a registry, however, such definition of the differently abled should be comprehensive. And indeed, on this side, we are well aware of the ramifications of that. We are well aware of all the dimensions of disability. We are well aware of that. More importantly, though, and the concern about whether or not we should have set up a committee, let me just say that several iterations of policies exist in Trinidad and Tobago concerning the issues with respect to the disabled community, and that some construct must be set up in the Tobago space to allow for us to take on board work that was already done, in addition to canvassing the public such that we can have their full involvement so that their views could be included. Tobago's position on this matter is that we need not wait on the tardiness of the Trinidad approach, and that we move towards having this policy developed. With respect to the issues around the inclusiveness in education, my colleague dealt extensively with those. The matters with respect to inclusiveness in employment in any area where there are gaps, I'm sure there's a commitment by all the members of the Executive Council to have those taken on board. What is certain is that for all of us, we are well aware of persons who belong to that community, but we are saying that there should be one Tobago community comprising all of us, whether you are called abled or differently abled. There's need for a one Tobago, a one conversation such that we can address the issues that affect all of us. We recognize as well that notwithstanding whatever models we want to work with, that there's need for an understanding of that, and that we bring together all of those views as we try to confront all of the issues that affect us. So whether it be the protection of the rights of the disabled community, whether it be access to decent work, whether it be support for families, whether it be issues with respect to equity, we all are aware of this issue, and this issue requires the attention of all of us. Madam Presiding Officer, persons with disabilities, as I said before, excuse me, they are likely to experience so many adverse outcomes, and it is that we are trying to address and trying to avoid. All of us, and I'm not saying we on this side, all of us are well aware of the challenges, and so that together we want to work as one team, and the reason for having a multidisciplinary team, it is to take into account the views, the specialties of various disciplines, to bring all of those together as we seek to confront and as we seek to address the challenges that face this most vulnerable group. We know of the neglect, we know of the deprivation, we know of the exclusion, and we are seeking as a body to address those. We must do, as the Assistant Secretary in Community Development, Enterprise Development and Labor said, we must do all that is in our power to assist the differently abled. Indeed, that must be our commitment. We must make the change, and we must make the change now. Now, as we wind up this motion, let me just quickly say to all of us that some work has been in progress, as the Assistant Secretary for Education, Innovation and Energy pointed to. In the case of Tobago, the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development, some work has happened. And the reason for us moving as we are moving, it is that there is a tardiness that we have to address. And may I say, the concern with respect to setting up of committees and all of that, that's taken, but may I say, there's a process for obtaining a status report on each and every committee within the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development, and I encourage you to explore that option to obtain such information. Since 2003, there was the establishment of a Disability Affairs Unit, and some staff, albeit minimum amount of staff, were engaged. 1 decade ago, that's 2008, an association for the differently abled was approved and not implemented. However, in 2018, a decade later, following meetings with the differently abled community, an amendment to that, that note was submitted, and we now have an approval such that this committee, and they've started to work, may I say, although it's 10 years late. We have had as well representatives from the same group working together in terms of critical areas of need, and they're developing their own course descriptors because they feel that they need training for persons who work with and for them. In addition to which, coming out of the Scarborough General Hospital, we continue to provide assessment for persons who are hearing or speech impaired. These assessments for persons with developmental needs continue. This is nowhere near enough. There's much more to be done. We continue to meet with the Ministry of Social Development on matters of mutual interest as we seek to strengthen the national policy framework. However, we need to do much more. And so, whereas earlier it was mentioned that this is a waste of time, I think it is, I disagree that this is a waste of time. I believe that this is timely. It is in sync with what is happening, be it not notwithstanding not what is happening in the Trinidad space, but we believe that this is timely. As I mentioned, the next convention is to come in another 2 weeks, and we expect, as you're saying, no one should be left behind. Indeed, none of the members of our population who are differently abled in Tobago must be left behind. We recognize the pervasive culture that exists in terms of how we've been treating with our differently abled. And it is for us as persons in the Assembly, persons in the opposition, all of us of Tobago, to do our part to turn that around. Excuse me. Madam Presiding Officer, we will continue to advocate. We will continue to be the voices. We will continue to be those because we require much more action in this regard. As I said earlier, notwithstanding the presence of a robust policy framework in several areas, the matter of inclusiveness in many facets, that is a challenge for us. It certainly eludes us. And so we spoke of inclusiveness. We spoke of holistic approach to several areas. We spoke of violation of human rights experienced by persons with disabilities. We spoke of those negative societal attitudes. We spoke about employment and decent work. Indeed, we spoke about every key area that's of concern to us. As I close, Madam Presiding Officer, I want to thank my colleagues on this side. I also want to thank members of the minority team for their contribution. We look forward not just for their support today, but the concerns that you have with respect to implementation rest with all of us. It rests with all of us here, all of us in our various workspaces, such that we could impact the lives, not just of those persons who are differently abled, but all our lives. I thank you.
Leader of Assembly Business.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I beg to move that this House continue to sit until we have dispensed with all of the business of the order people.
Members, the question is that this House continues to sit until we complete the sitting today. All in favor? Aye. Any against? The question being put is, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015 speaks to, among other things, reduced inequalities and the promotion of a peaceful and inclusive society. And whereas at the national level there is a recognition of the need for a policy to govern work and employment as it relates to differently abled persons, and whereas the Tobago House of Assembly has provided support to the numerous differently abled Tobagonians directly through disability grants and indirectly through partnership with several non-governmental agencies, non-governmental organizations, which cater to the specific needs of the differently abled. And whereas the Tobago House of Assembly, through the Division of Health, Wellness, and Family Development, has identified the need for increased focus and accelerated action for the inclusion of the differently abled in the workplace. Be it resolved that this House support the Executive Council decision to set up a broad-based, multidisciplinary stakeholder committee to prepare a position paper with an emphasis on inclusion of differently abled persons in the workplace in Tobago. And be it further resolved that this committee formulate a framework for the establishment of a register of differently abled persons on the island. All in favor? Aye. Any against? Any abstaining? This motion is carried.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. I beg to move that this House now stand adjourned to a date to be fixed.
Honorable members, the question is that this House now stand adjourned to a date to be fixed. All in favor? Aye. Any against? The House stands adjourned for a date to be fixed.